I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw how the trees leaned toward the lodge. They didn't just crowd the drive the way mountain pines lean into wind. They tilted like listeners, trunks angling with an intent I could feel through the windshield. Aspens flickered above them, pale trunks 1 heartbeat away from silver, and the road that had been a thin strip of gravel for the last hour opened into a clearing where Blackwater Lodge squatted, all dark shingles and long, low eaves. The place was bigger than it looked in the photos my cousin sent. More wings, more porches, a lodge you could get lost in if you liked corners. It sat at the edge of Blackwater Lake, an alpine tarn the old maps called bottomless, ringed with pines and wind and a seam of late snow in the gullies. Everything immediate smelled like gun oil and old cedar, the same scent Ray always had on his hands when he fixed something in the garage. I had driven up from Denver with a U-Haul attached like a second thought. Job gone. Lease ending. Someone had to take care of the place, my aunt said over the phone 2 days after Raymond Halpern's funeral. You know how your grandfather hated wasting things. You could finish it up. Take your time. It was supposed to be a generosity, inheritance clean and solved. In truth, it was arithmetic. The lodge was a property tax bill with a family name on the deed and a key on a loop that felt like destiny when it clicked in my palm. Inside, it kept its dark. Light collected in bowls of dust and the long bar of the entryway where Ray used to sit in winter. This is where he put his coffee. This is where he set his tools. The house remembered him in small habits. There were mounted heads on the walls. A moose with a spread like a cathedral, a mule deer with velvet the color of dusk, a mountain goat that looked almost bored. Their glass eyes caught the yellow light and turned it into a stare that never blinked. For a few minutes I unpacked in ritual, the kettle up, curtains pulled, the old cast-iron stove wiped down with a rag stiff with decades of dryness, and I felt a domestic steadiness. Check the locks, sweep the porch, run the water. It was what you do when you want to prove to yourself you can be ordinary. It was the ledger that made ordinary crack. On the dining table, shoved under a stack of hunting magazines and an envelope of property tax notices, lay a single piece of typewritten paper. House rules for whoever stays after dark, the header proclaimed in an indifferent serif. The sheet had been folded until the paper was soft at the creases, and half the lines were struck with a heavy hand, black ink over type like someone tried to talk the house into quiet. The lines that remained were simple and impossible in equal measure. They read like instructions and also like threats. Lock the back door before sunset. Do not open curtains facing the tree line between midnight and 3 a.m. If the fireplace lights itself, keep your back to it. If the mounted heads turn to watch you, pretend not to notice. Do not remove trophies from the walls. Never, under any circumstance, take one down. Voices at the glass are not what they seem. Do not answer. There were other lines where the letters had been gone over and gone over again until the words dissolved into black. After a breath, I felt the old, cold pulse of being watched, in that lodge way that isn't rude enough to be immediate and jarring. It feels like someone leaning on a wall you'd forgotten you were standing against. I sat at the table and smoothed out the paper as if I could lay the rules flat into being harmless, and when I tried to imagine the handwriting, Ray's maybe or one of the older keepers, I couldn't. There were practical things to do. The furnace chirped, but the upstairs thermostat read low. The old hot water heater coughed, then found an oily life. I opened cupboards and inventoried plates and stacked firewood by the hearth. The kettle sang an impatient, domestic note I didn't realize I'd been craving for weeks. For a while, the house let me pretend I wasn't inheriting any weight that wasn't mine. A place to sleep, a place to fix, a place to be alone without the pressure of other people's lives or the city's light leaking in. I read the rules twice more before the sun slid behind the ridgeline and the lodge began to rearrange itself into nighttime. Outside, the wind moved through the aspens like paper, and I put up the new shower curtain I found in a hall closet because the old one had a singing mildew smell. I nailed a strip of weathered plywood over a small window on the north wall where glass had previously been cracked. Practical things. Good work. Later, when I went to lock the back door, the small gouges in the timber frame caught the light. A series of cuts, notched like a very slow calendar. I slept badly the first night. For the first stretch, the house made the noises of an old thing settling. The faucet in the back bathroom thunking as the pressure equalized, the wind in the eaves making the metal gutters sing. But somewhere near 2 in the morning, something else started. A rhythm at the front door that arranged itself into 3 knocks. Not a bang, not a polite ring, 3 clear, even knocks, paused as if counting, then 3 more. It had a cadence like a person at attention, or like something stern that had been trained by rituals to measure. I convinced myself it was a neighbor. There are seasonal cabins clustered around Blackwater Lake. People come and go. I checked the door through the peephole, and the porch light threw a small cone of the world into relative comfort. I could see the steps, the rocking chair, the Adirondack. No one stood there. The knock came again. This time the pause between sets felt like breath. I don't believe in being brave for show. I waited at the threshold and then went out, palms warm and empty, flashlight in my hand. The road beyond the tree line glittered with the night's breath. There were tracks in the soft shoulder of snow, boot prints that led away in a direction that made sense, toward the path the lodge's caretakers used for late walks. But the prints stopped at the edge of the porch light and seemed to have been erased from there to the darkness, like someone had walked into something that didn't want a print left upon it. When I told myself to go back inside, I heard a voice, soft, familiar in the way that a song you haven't played for years is familiar, and it said, Mara. The inflection had Ray's cadence. He would say my name like a question, and then fill the space with a story he was about to tell. For a second the years fell away, like a bookmark pulling loose. My throat closed. I kept the door shut. I put my weight against it and listened. The knocking came again, same 3 slow beats, and the name came shaped like Ray again, Mara, closer, from the lip of the porch, from the dark between the trees. Something outside clicked its tongue like a hinge. I did the sensible thing. I thumbed the lock, drew the deadbolt, and went to the window to pull the curtain closed. The next morning, daylight made everything polite. The lodge had softened into alkalinity, the stove's iron face warm, the coffee bitter in a good way, the mounted heads pretending to be nothing other than trophies. I told myself the voice had been memory, that if I'd stayed in the city I would have latched onto the same sounds from a different angle. Someone down the hall at an apartment complex calling a neighbor, a friend in a bar. Memory is a traitor in the dark. Cousin Eli arrived that day in a pickup that looked like it had been borrowed from an old rock song. He laughed when he saw the U-Haul. Eli was, in a way, my best unplanned plan. Younger by a few years, a mechanic with a fondness for old things and an optimist's stomach for projects. He moved with too much confidence into the house, opened the windows, and called the place quintessential in a voice that made me want to smack him for being earnest. He brought lunch, a box of screws, a cigarette smell that seemed less offensive in the high air. "You're in deep," he said, lifting the corner of a rug. "This place eats money, not to mention common sense." "Not now," I said. "Help me with the upstairs sink." He found the rules before I could. It was Eli who unfolded the typewritten paper like someone handling a keystone and read it aloud with a smirk he didn't know how to keep from falling apart. For all his jokes, the edges of his mouth went thin. He ran his thumb over the places where the ink had been struck out, where letters turned into heavy shadow. "Well," he said, "that's dramatic." He left chalk marks on the floor where he thought he should make repairs. He took inventory in a way that was methodical, a stack of plates, a record player, a tin full of bullets in a jar. He tested lights and laughed when the generator choked and the lamps died with a coy, apologetic stutter. That night, he took the couch in the den. I slept in Ray's old bedroom, the bed still lumpy where he'd sat reading. We each had a lamp within arm's reach and a sense, private and clinging, that this was still a camping trip and camp would end. The second night, the knocks came with more insistence. I woke to the 3-beat cadence, a transcribed metronome. This time the voice called me by an old nickname only Ray used. The sound threaded through the house like the scent of his pipe smoke. I stood up, heartbeat too slow with the weirdness of wanting and not wanting to answer. Eli grunted and turned over. "Probably a raccoon," he muttered, without opening his eyes. The doorknob rattled. Not the knock so much as a slow, rubbing pressure against the wood, as if something had lips and teeth and patience. There were new scratches along the edge of the doorframe, shallow half-moons, like someone had been counting the ways to get in. I pressed my palm to them and felt the grain of the wood. Under my hand, the cuts were colder than the rest of the door. They were not animal. When I went to the window and drew back the curtain, the glass answered with its own small universe. It was midnight, 11:58 p.m., the clock on the mantel-ball said, and beyond the glass, the tree line was a tide of darkness. But there were faces at the windows of the trees, small pale ovals that looked like the reflection of the mounted heads, like a trick of lamplight, like eyes slightly wrong. They were not human eyes exactly. They were thin and flat and pressed like water against the inside of a bowl. I have a photograph of it in my mind I can't bring myself to print, not faces distinct, but impressions, smudges, the suggestion of noses, mouths pulled open in slits of interest. They watched with a stillness that is worse than movement. "That's nobody," Eli said, now sitting up and squinting at the glass. "That's—" He trailed off as two of the mounted heads nearest the hearth snapped their glass eyes toward him. The moose stared at the couch with a tilt so precise I heard it in bones. The glass eyes reflected the lamplight and made a double of the room that felt like someone had set a camera in the wall. "Don't look," I said. "Don't look?" he answered, incredulous, then looked. His face folded in an expression I hadn't seen on him before, something like the slow register of fear mixed with the calculus of a man who has learned that sometimes you have to do the thing before you decide if it's possible. We did not remove anything from the walls. God knows that sentence alone, put on paper, looks ridiculous. But rules are not supernatural because of their artistry. They are supernatural because obeying them prints you into a system that rewards certain kinds of compliance. Eli wanted to take down a head to take a closer look. He went to the great room with a crowbar wedged in the crook of his shoulder like a guitar, joking to keep the shape of the moment from hardening. He pulled at the bolts, and as the trophy's mount began to shift, the glass eyes blinked. You don't know the word for a thing located wrong in your world until you are standing in front of it. The glass blinked like a human blink, slow as viscous oil. The moose's upper lip twitched as if it were tasting the air. The hair at the back of my neck stood up so dramatically I felt it physically, a line of sensation like a chill. Eli's grin bounced off his face and fell into a small, frightened mouth. "Okay," Eli said, dropping the crowbar. He backed away with the kind of speed that removes himself from an experiment. The moose did not move again. That night the fireplace threw a blue and strange light, and then went out and then flared without warning. The coal bed brightened, not in the way of a log catching, but as if someone had exhaled, and the embers answered. In that breath a voice came, so close to someone I knew it hurt. It was my mother's accent, the way she pronounced certain vowels. She was alive, and I had not spoken to her in weeks, and I couldn't have known how her voice would sound to this room, and still it said, "You don't have to be alone, Mara." And that syllable, my name, folded like a careful hand. I covered my ears and told myself to stop being ridiculous. If I let myself be convinced by mimicry, then I opened myself to a dozen other manipulations. But when you hear a voice that should be dead and warm and personal enough to make your heart rearrange, reason becomes a small and inadequate tool. The journal was in the attic, tucked beneath a moth-eaten parka. The handwriting tilted like it had to lean to keep from falling off the paper. The first entry I found was dated October 12, 1997. It started orderly and became erratic by the bottom of the page. Journal excerpt, Raymond Halpin, 10/12/1997. The rules are not polite. They are a ledger. We keep 1 foot in the dark and 1 foot in the light. They watch, they learn. Say the name wrong, and they will correct it. Another entry years later was written in a denser hand. The dates marched like wounds. Journal excerpt, RH, 23/2004. Tom read the first rule and laughed. We found the fox traps on his porch the next morning. It was clean, no blood, just a smell like iron and rain. It names you slowly. There were Polaroids folded between pages, grainy captures of people whose faces were only dimly visible, as if a camera had refused to commit. In one, the glass might have reflected a hand over a face. In another, a child's shoe half buried in snow. The images were less evidence than residue. They suggested a life of answering wrong and paying for it. Reed Morrison called that week. He sounded older on the phone than he had in the photograph I remembered, his voice a map of town gossip and hunting years. He'd come up to work on the dock in summer decades ago, and he'd been around while my grandfather kept the place. "You live there now?" he asked. I told him I was trying. He paused long enough to put the sky between us and then said, "Don't let the lodge map you." "Map me?" "It watches everything," Reed said. "It learns how you fold your hands, how you sleep. Once it knows the inside of you, leaving's not like walking out the front door. It's not impossible," he added quickly, "but it gets harder." "How do you mean, gets harder?" "Every rule keeps you safer, but every time you follow a rule it takes a thread. Keep them thin, keep them neat, don't—" His voice broke off, and then for a moment he laughed like it was a bad joke. "Don't let it be the only reason you breathe." I thought that phrase would be enough to keep me moving, but Reed's warning came with credibility and a small tremor that made the hair on my arms stand up. I took his admonition home and put it on the mantel like an object that needed to be examined. Keep the rules thin, keep them neat. They are a debt and a lifeline in equal measure. The rules I had read were a start, but there were others tucked into margins, typed up in scratch paper stuffed in drawers. Do not let anyone who is not blood sleep unguarded in the east wing. If you hear a whistling, count to 9 and do not whistle back. Always leave a cup of coffee on the mantel on the night of the first snowfall. There was a logic to them that felt less arbitrary than practical. Offerings, avoidance of movement at certain hours, mimicry of normalcy to placate whatever listened. There is a peculiar moral erosion that comes from following rules you do not understand. Each adherence becomes a tiny moral acceptance. You obey, then you rationalize the obedience as necessary. You light the candle on the mantel because the paper says to, and after 3 nights, you find yourself making a second candle because it would be rude not to. That is not a metaphor. It is practical. After a week, I found myself counting the knocks into patterns, because if a knock arrived in anything other than 3s, the house would make a sound like a tongue on the stone. I started to fasten the blinds at 10 and to leave the porch light on until dawn. I swept the hearth with a ritual I could not name and began to understand what my grandfather meant by negotiation. Eli's skepticism crumbled in small ways. He started sleeping with the light on. He asked to keep the crowbar in the den because it felt like a thing to have. And yet, he helped me with the ledger. He drove me into town for supplies, and when a woman at the hardware store asked if we were making repairs, he lied about the reason for being there and said we were fixing up for a rental, and watched the woman's expression soften with sympathy, which feels, when you're in the mountains, like a small kindness. Night after night, The noises escalated. It started with the knock and the voice. Then there were the whistling sounds from the tree line. At first a high, curious trill that made the hair on the back of my neck steady. Then a lower drone that harmonized with the house's timbers. Once, in the early morning, the whistling imitated the tune Ray used to whistle while he fixed the generator, and I swear to you now that I could see him over the island in the kitchen, hands chapped, smiling like he had a secret. I stood in the doorway, stomach flattened by grief and longing, and I felt the lodge measure me like a deer at a trough. We tried simple tests. We left the back door unlocked and sat in the kitchen with pots on our knees. We didn't answer it. The knocks subsided into the night, but at 3 a.m. something heavier moved across the upstairs hall, a sound like footsteps that did not touch the stairs but pressed against the ceiling with confident, shifting weight. At dawn, we counted a new set of notches in the doorframe. They were deeper and fresher. One night I came downstairs to find the fireplace lit, and a single desktop clock on the mantel fully stopped at 12 hours a.m., hands aligned like soldiers. The fire was blue at the edges, and it spoke. Soft and patient. It said a name I hadn't prepared for. It said, Eli. And I could see him through the smoke, though he wasn't in the room. A memory inserted into flame. He was laughing with someone who had been dead for 5 years, a woman whose laugh slotted into the fireplace's throat like a stolen instrument. Eli woke up and told me he had dreamt the woman had told him to go outside and bring her back. We began to lock the bedroom doors at night and to run wood through the stove until the metal warmed. The house rewarded these small conformities, nights of relative quiet, less pressure at the frame of the windows. Obedience worked, in the way a bandage works. You buy an hour of safety at the cost of acceptance. Reed had said to keep the rules thin, don't give it everything, and so we rationed. We placed a cup of coffee on the mantel the night an early snowfall came. We left a plate of cold meat, cured venison, on the table near the pantry because the ledger said food left in the proper place would be counted differently. The mansion's appetite is a slow thing. It learns the shape of you. One afternoon in the back pantry, I found a small wooden box with a name etched into the lid. Kayla. There were teeth inside the box, small, polished like tokens, and a scrap of paper folded tight with a single typed rule beneath it. Do not take the teeth into your mouth. I almost laughed. I put the box back because some things you do not touch twice. Weeks warped into one another. Reed's warnings became a map I consulted when I felt confused. He told a story once about a man, Jim Lewin, who'd come to the lodge and left lighter than he arrived, and about Tom Carver who'd set traps and found his traps broken and then himself unnamed in a journal. The ledger had entries that mentioned them. Reed said the lodge understood transactions better than it understood names. It would trade comfort for pieces of memory. It kept the receipts. Eli left after a month. He left with a bag and a face that had been rearranged into something less like bravado and more like someone who had seen the underside of a thing and didn't want to go home with its echo. He said aloud that the lodge was getting into his teeth. It wants you to be the person who keeps the house, he told me in the car as we locked the front gate. He paused, wrenching his jaw around a laugh that wanted to be an apology. Take the ledger, he said. Just promise me you won't go to bed with the curtains open. When the truck's tail lights lost the turn of the road, I closed the gate and listened to the trees. They didn't have to lean. They were already leaning. I told myself no one would come out here again who mattered except for us. I told myself the ledger was a set of regional superstitions and that when the money came in and I fixed the leak in the north wing and put a better lock on the pantry, I'd sell the place to someone who liked history and had more patience. The thing with these stories, you tell yourself endings the way you tell yourself reasons for leaving. It is a human trick to make a narrative you can survive. Later I would compare the lodge to a ledger and say it was stupid to think of it as anything else. But in the first months, the rules were the shape of a bargain and the bargain was simple. Follow them, and the house would not eat you in the way that leaves you unrecognizable. The day before the first deep freeze, I found another sheet. It was in the pocket of Ray's old jacket, folded small and nearly invisible. The header had lines of type and a smudge like a thumbprint where someone had read and reread. The rules were clearer here, a kind of operative list. Lock the back door before sunset. Do not open curtains facing the tree line between midnight and 3 a.m. If the fireplace lights itself, keep your back to it. If the mounted heads turn to watch you, pretend not to notice. Do not remove trophies from the walls, never. Voices at the glass are not what they seem. Do not answer. If someone calls you with a familiar voice, do not open the door. If they press, play a name they cannot know. The last line, play a name they cannot know, felt like a trick you could use. I tried it once. The next time the voice said, Mara, and I answered with an old neighbor's name, a child I used to babysit 15 years ago. The voice stuttered and lost cadence like a reel catching. For a moment I felt like a clever person. For a moment the lodge let out a small, disappointed sound through the ribs of the house. At 11:34 p.m., on a night when the wind was a clean and bitter blade, the knock was at the back door in its familiar pattern, 3 slow beats, 3 slow beats. The house had learned my answers and measured how quickly I would give them. I stood at the kitchen island with the ledger in my hand and the last cup of coffee gone cold. I could step to the door and open it and see nothing and then be done with it. Or I could pretend I had not heard, and the house could go on learning how to talk without anyone listening. The knock came again. This time, the voice that followed it shaped itself into something that was not only my grandfather, but my lover from months ago. Someone who had left explanations tangled at the edge of my voicemail. Mara, the voice called, 2 syllables, 1 heartbeat, and then a laugh like someone offering an apology. I felt the rules like a garment. They fit oddly, and I hated how natural they felt the longer I wore them. I thought of Eli's hands on the crowbar and his slow exit. I thought of Reed's map thing and the ledger's quiet insistence. My fingers tightened against the paper. I did not answer the door. I did not open the curtains. The knocks continued, polite and methodical. The voice switched names like a magician changing cards, and each time I refused, the knocking cadence grew more complex. 3, pause, 3, pause, 2. Quick ones that might have been a calculation. My throat filled with salt. I was tired of playing a negotiation I had not asked to be part of. At 12:01 a.m., the fireplace flared, and the heads on the wall turned with a motion that was almost thought. The moose's glass caught the light and made a small, terrible double of me in the room. Mara in winter sweater, Mara with the ledger, Mara standing like a sentry. The fire drew a breath and whispered, in my grandfather's voice, "It's easier if you come back inside." I took the ledger and crossed a line through the day in ink. Small, practical ritual, and walked to the back door with my hand on the knob. The leather of the knob was cool in my palm. The porch light cut a cone into the night, where the boot prints led away and then stopped. The knocking paused like a breath held in someone else's lung. When I turned the knob, for the briefest instant, the whole world felt like an agreement. The house, the rules, the people who had been there before, and me. My foot stayed where it was. I did not open the door. Instead, I closed the ledger and slid it into my jacket. I left the curtain drawn. I tucked the extra plywood into the shed and whispered into the dark, something like a promise I wasn't sure I meant. The lodge exhaled around me, soft as steam. The knocking stopped. The whistling faded at the tree line. I went to bed and kept a lamp within reach. In the morning, the doorframe had fresh marks, small honeyed grooves that looked like teeth, but the porch itself was empty. The footprints were gone. If obedience breeds safety, and safety breeds debt, then by that logic I had both been frugal and poor. When you live in a house with rules that ask you not to be curious, Curiosity does not die. It accumulates. It sits in your chest like a stone, waiting to see if your hand will pick it up. I told myself to be clever and keep the rules thin. I told myself to keep them neat. I told myself to leave the ledger in a drawer and treat every night like a test I would pass. For a while it seemed to work. The house hummed its old polite tune. The lake was a dark bowl, and the aspens whispered in a way that felt, if you squinted, almost normal. And still, things began to change. The trophies watched with a new kind of hunger. The whistling grew curious. The ledger's crossed-out lines seemed to whisper at me from the drawer. There were nights when the curtains opened by themselves, and I found the room full of a low, white light that pressed through the window like an audience at midnight. On those nights, the house reminded me I had moved in. Not to keep it, but to be kept. At 2:03 a.m. on a night that smelled of snow and something else, the knock at the front door came again. 3 beats, 3 beats. The house had learned more than my name. It had learned how to ask. I sat up, the ledger heavy in my hand, thinking of all the small decisions that had got me here. The unemployment notice folded like a bless, the last argument that ended without answers. I thought of Ray and how he had left me the key with such casual gravity. I thought of Eli's tail lights disappearing and of Reed's warning, which had become a map in my head. The rhythm at the door changed. The voice spoke as if reading from the ledger itself. It wasn't calling me by any name I had for myself. It said simply, "Keeper." I did not know if that was invitation or indictment. I did know the house had another way of asking: remove a trophy, leave it alone, open a curtain, close it, answer and you might be home, refuse and sometimes you sleep. I tucked the ledger into my pillow and listened as the lodge took note. As if a book had been laid on a scale, and the weight of everything inside it now mattered. The 3 knocks came once more, measured and patient. The house was waiting to see what I would do. The house was waiting to see what I would do. I did what the ledger suggested. I kept the rules thin. I slept with the book under my pillow and a lamp within reach. I wrapped myself in ritual, double-checked bolts, left coffee on the mantel the first heavy night of snow, kept the blinds down between midnight and 3. The lodge softened in small ways. It offered small reprieves, the sort that made you believe obedience was a kind of cleverness. For a while, I could pretend the whole thing was manageable. But the lodge has patience. It is a slow arithmetic. Each rule you follow subtracts something from you and deposits it into the house's account. You only notice when the balance slips. On the 3rd week, the knocking changed. At 1:11 a.m., the front door received 3 beats, so precise they sounded like a metronome set to cruelty. They came measured and perfectly spaced, and after them came a single soft whistling note from the grove. 3 tones, a melancholy ladder down. Inside, something rearranged its weight. The mounted heads along the hallway turned with that same slow, almost deliberate motion, glass catching lamplight and throwing replicas of us into the room. For a moment we were a room of duplicates, every trophy making our own face into an animal's trait, the moose somehow more paternal, the goat more mocking. That night the fireplace didn't simply whisper, it narrated. It took voices Ray used to keep in his pocket, the cadence he used when he lectured me about oil-stained hands, his tired joke, assembled them into sentences and offered them as counsel. "Keep it neat," it said, and then softer. "Keep us listed." The voice smelled faintly of bourbon and damp wool. My hand shook so badly I spilled coffee on the ledger, a dark halo that beaded like a bruise on the paper. I began writing too. Not only did I read the ledger, I wrote in the margins, dates, small rules I thought might help. Don't open the basement door after the 3rd set of knocks. Always leave a light burning in the pantry. Play the name it cannot know. My handwriting grew slanted and quick, like a hand that wants to get something done before it forgets what it meant to say. There were signs in other parts of the house that someone, other than me, was counting. One afternoon I found the basement door, heavy oak with an iron ring, ajar, a sliver. It was not how I'd left it. The hinges looked clean, as if oil had been recently applied. When I knelt and looked down the stairs, the light guttered, and something in the dark breathed out a damp, metallic smell. For a second I saw a shape like the outline of a handprint on the concrete wall. But when I reached for the flashlight, the impression was gone, washed clean as if someone had just licked the surface. Journal excerpt, RH 1122, 2001. Basement keeps what we throw under it. Do not go looking for things. They will not be found. They will find you. Jim went for a ladder and came back with a list of names instead. I think the most dangerous thing the lodge offered was familiarity. It didn't have to invent new tricks. It borrowed ours. It listened, and then it practiced until it got the accents right. One night at 2:37 a.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand with a message from a number I recognized but didn't know. Eli's old number, one I had his voice printed to in the way you learn your fingerprints. The text was a line I had written to him months before. "You okay?" The screen glowed like a liar's face. Panic bends a person in private ways. I drove into Ridgewater, this little town, the place you tell yourself you'll go when you're trying to be normal. Parked outside a motel with an orange neon sign, and slept in a bed that wasn't mine. I booked a room for 2 nights and planned to figure out the rest in daylight. Contact an agent, start formal repairs, list the lodge, sell it. I wanted it to be arithmetic again, property value, taxes, a line on a spreadsheet. But at 3:14 a.m., the whistling started at the window of the motel room, a small, high trill that resolved into the same 3 notes I'd heard at the lodge. I woke, with my throat filling with ash. You can drive all the way to I-25 and still feel the lodge. That was the part that surprised me. Not that grief would follow, but that the thing that had watched me for weeks could fit itself into the small space of my rented bed. The whistling wasn't outside the glass. It was folded into the curtains, into the hum of the heater, into the part of my head that kept remembering Ray calling my name kind and accusatory at the same time. I came back the next morning with more haste than sense. The drive up was a study in light, the peaks of distant mountains catching sun like teeth. The aspens looked like a book turned open. I parked at the gate and for a brief second planned to go on, the way people resolve to measure their fear and decide to live anyway. I told myself I wasn't walking in. I was only checking. I was only taking inventory. There is a difference of degree, perhaps, but not of kind. Walking in and saying, "I'll try again," is how a person is folded into the ledger. The lodge had been patient, and the ledger had not moved. But the lodge had taken steps. There were new notches along the inside of the back door frame, deeper than before. The pantry smelled not only of cured meat, but of something like teeth. And in the living room, a Polaroid lay, where it hadn't been 3 days before. A blurred image of someone standing in the doorway, their face too smeared for features, but hunched in a way that looked like my own shadow. The timestamp on the back read a date I knew I had been in Ridgewater 2 nights earlier. How had the lodge made a picture that I had taken in a motel? The camera had been charging in the glove compartment. I hadn't brought it. There were too many ways for logic to fail and the house to keep the rest. In the margins of the journal, Ray wrote that the lodge traded more generously than money. It traded continuity. It made copies. Reed came up, finally, not by phone but by truck, his jacket smelling of diesel and old leather. He drove because a man who insists on living with something else for decades tends to test things in person. Warnings over signal get chewed by rumor. He sat in Ray's chair and studied the ledger like a map of teeth. "You've let it learn too much," he said without preamble. He was a small, wiry thing, his hands like tools that had been used and then put on a bench. "You can't be the same person who goes into a place that knows you, not if you want to leave." "What do you mean, learn too much?" I asked. "It folds your habits into its grammar. You leave coffee on the mantel, it learns the way you count. You answer the doorbell, even in your head. It learns how you hear voices. You try to trick it with names and it'll come up with a better one. It works like a ledger because it keeps receipts. You start trading pieces of who you are, and after a while there's not enough of you left to make walking away easy. Reed told another story then, softer, of a man named Tom Carver who'd come up arrogant and confident, calling the house Old Man Superstition. He'd taken a hatchet to a trophy once, in the wrong wing, and come back with the sensation that someone else had been in his bed. Another name, the same Jim Lewin, appeared in Ray's handwriting as a trailing caution, a man who left a tent lighter than he'd arrived, a man whose laughter would sometimes be heard in a locked car at night, long after his boots had left the property. Reed's eyes, when he said these names, didn't glitter with triumph. They were wet with memory. "How do you stop it?" I asked. "You don't start trading in the first place," he said. "But if you've started, you keep the threads neat. You don't give it the rest. You don't take it out for company, and you don't invite ghosts to breakfast. When people come, keep them moving. When they leave..." He cut the thought short with a gesture I understood as, "Don't give it a foothold." In the journal there was an entry Ray had written in his last season, in his cramped hand with an ink that had bled at the edges. Journal excerpt, RH 3/4/2015. "We tried to map our absence, but the lodge maps us instead. We give it names and it learns to call them. Give it a small thing and you have bought one quiet night. Give it a life and you owe a ledger. Do not mistake survival for contract." It is an odd thing to carry the idea of being mapped, as though you are a route on a chart. You begin to notice yourself in terms of coordinates, how you breathe at 3 in the morning, the angle you turn your head when a voice says your name. Reed's warning became an audit. I tried to calculate what I had traded. Time, patience, memories. Faces that felt familiar but which came to me as echoes at odd hours. But calculation, like resolve, can be brittle. The lodge is not only patient, it is persuasive in very particular ways. It offered moments of intimacy that felt like rescue. A fire would flare and someone would tell me a joke my grandfather used to make, and the heat of that memory would feel like a hand on my shoulder. It is easy to let a house stand in for people you miss. That is the crack the lodge widens. Escalation came in the winter, when snow pressed the world into white silence and the nights went on and on. One storm night, the curtains in the great room drew back by themselves at 12:33 a.m., and the panes filled with faces. They were not the faces of living neighbors. They were closer to the impressions in the Polaroids, smudges, the suggestion of eyes and mouths like painted masks. They pressed their palms to the glass, and the panes bowed, just enough to make the reflection of our lamps fragment the room into many smaller rooms. For an instant it felt as though the whole forest had come to attend. "Don't look," I whispered to myself, the rule brittle in my mouth like something recited to settle a child. Eli was gone then. The house had emptied out to me and the ledger. I understood suddenly how a person might stay, not because of fear alone, but because the house had begun to look like the only place where someone would call your name correctly. Sometimes the house doesn't steal you all at once. It borrows what it can and leaves the residue as temptation. It gets into the margins of your life. You answer a knock that sounds like someone you loved, and in doing so you put a foot inside its book. You hold it there with the ledger like a scalpel. I found myself, absurd, ashamed, making bargains in the dark. One night I left a small strip of cured venison on the pantry table. The next morning it was gone, and there was a note on the ledger in Ray's hand, payment acknowledged. The pen strokes were shaky and irritable, and there was a small confetti of ash, as though someone had exhaled with pleasure. I tried to keep the rules thin. I told myself stories about contracts and limits. But the lodge is an institution of habit. It learns the tone of your apology. It catalogues the cadence of your refusal. If you obey, you remain safe in the immediate sense. If you resist, it ups the ante. The night the basement door opened fully was the night I understood what ups the ante meant. It was 2:58 a.m. I woke to a vibration, soft at first, then a scraping like a key being run along the underside of the stairs. The house didn't have the rush and roar of an outside storm. Instead, there was a local, intimate noise that seemed contained beneath the floorboards. On the kitchen table, the blue of the mantel clock settled at wide, accusing hands. I stood in the dark and felt the whole lodge breathing under my feet, an inhalation that was like an invitation. The basement light wasn't on when I went down. The steps smelled of cold stone and the kind of damp that collects in old foundations, metal, something like wet cloth. Halfway down, I heard them. Voices, muffled as if behind a wall. They called names, not mine, but names I had written at the back of the ledger, the names of people who'd been here before. They were not pleading as one might expect. They spoke in the flat timbre of something reporting. "Another entry," one voice said. "Add her to the list," another answered. I never saw figures. The light at the bottom of the stairs was a pale wedge. The door at the far end of the basement stood slightly open, and beyond it was a further darkness, something like a room that had refused to be photographed. On the floor, there were objects placed with careful symmetry. A handful of old keys, a rusted pocket knife, a child's shoe with one lace untied. The arrangement had a humility. It looked like leftover offerings. I knew, with a clarity that felt ridiculous and precise, that if I entered that room, something would notice me differently. The ledger had rules about the basement. Do not go into the lower hold after midnight without leaving a light on. Do not bring a camera. Do not answer if something says it remembers you. The rules had been written because someone, some long line of someones, had done exactly the opposite, and there were consequences accounted for. I closed the basement door and shoved the bolt into the strike plate. The metal banged with a small, resonant sound. My pulse thudded in my ears. The lodge, for a second, let out a sound that could have been satisfaction. After that night, the lodge grew more assertive. The knocks came not only at doors, but against panes of windows, moving over the glass in patterns until I could not tell whether the rhythm was inside or outside. Sometimes faces pressed to the glass that were too close, too many mouths in one place. The mounted heads began to watch with a different insistence. Their glass eyes, those small, convex lenses, caught light and held it like a lamp. Once I moved one of the smaller trophies to dust a crack, and the deer head turned its head fractionally to look at me. I dropped the rag, and my hand left a smear on the velvet of its nose that refused to wash. The ledger started to grow, not just with my notes, but with a slow accretion of other people's handwriting. Pages had been added, loose sheets inserted with typed lines in a typewriter that had missed its ribbon. Some were Ray's, others had a tight, cramped hand I couldn't attribute. There were names I recognized from the journals, Tom, Jim, and new ones I would later learn the lodge had taught itself through oral repetition. The ledger became both instruction manual and family album in reverse, and then the call came. Not a knock this time. The telephone on the hall table rang with a sound I had already learned to dread. The number displayed was local, Ridgewater Exchange, but when I answered, the voice on the other end wasn't the woman I called my mother, nor someone I knew. It folded my name like a pocket square and used it as punctuation. "Keeper," the voice said, and there was a small, satisfied pause. "Is the ledger kept by hand or by heart?" I hung up. The phone didn't ring again that night, but the question lodged like a splinter. Keep by hand or keep by heart? The ledger asks you to keep by hand. The lodge wants you to move toward keeping by heart. The difference is the difference between neat obedience and wholehearted surrender. Escape seemed to happen in stages. You don't run away in a single motion. You step into it. I tried to leave once more for longer. I packed a small bag, something like a furious economist's list. Clothes, the ledger, Ray's keys. I parked the truck at the driveway and walked down to where the road widened and thought about leaving. The air had that thin edge Colorado cold gives you in late winter. My breath showed for a moment like a small, ephemeral thing. I put the truck in gear and drove down the dirt road toward the 2-lane that would take me past Ridgewater and out onto the highway. I made it into town that afternoon and booked a room for a week. I felt absurdly proud of the motion, an honest, adult decision. I drank bad motel coffee and slept with curtains shut. On the third night, the television in the motel hummed with a station static, and in the middle of a weather report, a voice came through the television, speaking in a voice I had only heard in the lodge. It said, "You left a sock behind," and I saw, in the corner of my mind, the pantry and the small wooden box with Kayla's name. The illusion was precise enough to be persuasive. I drove back the next morning. When I opened the door to the lodge, the smell of cedar and coal was like a welcome and a verdict. Someone had been in my house while I was gone. New notches in the doorframe, a thin smear of ash on the mantel that wasn't there before. On the table was a small envelope with a note in a child's print. "We left the light by the pantry. K." It was Kayla's handwriting, all loops and bravado. She had come the day after I'd left. I had promised myself not to let anyone who wasn't blood sleep unguarded in the East Wing. Kayla was blood in the way that family sometimes is. Distant, schematic, a cousin once removed who had once broken her arm on my grandfather's porch swing. And yet she was closer to my age than Ray had ever been. She arrived with a backpack and a smile like someone who believed moving up to a lodge would be an adventure. She had been looking for work and a place to stay for a season, and when my aunt called and asked if she could come up and see the lodge, I said yes. I remember that decision with the same sort of clumsiness as a person who tries to explain why a bad choice was made on purpose. Kayla arrived in the kind of weather that makes mountains look hungry, clouds pushed low, a wind that had the taste of iron. She hugged me like cousins hug when they attempt intimacy, and then set down her pack and ate the leftover venison with a kind of fierce appetite. She was practical and irreverent. "This place looks like a museum of male ego," she said, and laughed at her own phrasing. I had not told Kayla the ledger's specifics. I told her about drafts, about plumbing quirks, about the generator's temper. I left out rules I thought would terrify her. But I couldn't hide everything. The porch light that always seems to flicker, the way the curtains sometimes move when no breeze is near. Secrets swell when withheld. Of course the lodge knew what I wasn't saying. It understood family dynamics and leverage. It is patient with omissions. The first night Kayla slept in the East Wing, the lodge tested its reach. At 12:47 a.m., a knock came at the guest room door. It didn't say a name. It said a lullaby my grandmother used to hum, and the voice had a familiarity that made Kayla's breath hitch. She opened the door a fraction, and there was nothing. Only the long, dim hallway and the lamp at the far end, making a small, orange pool of light. When I asked her about it in the morning, she laughed it off, half brave in the way people make jokes to negotiate fear. "Probably a raccoon or something," she said. But her fingers fiddled at the hem of her sleeve in the way an animal trembles when it's pretending to be bored. It is humiliating and also a little dangerous to admit that what I felt watching Kayla was not entirely repulsion. The ledger gives you tools. It explains what to do. It also gives you leverage. There were nights when the lodge offered me something like relief. I could sleep in fewer waking breaths if someone else carried the watch. You could call it delegation or indifference. For me, it became a convenience layered with shame. There is a rule, older, typed on a yellowing slip, that Ray left in a pack I found taped to the underside of his bedside table. I had only glanced at it once when I was drinking too much black coffee at 3 in the morning. The rule read simply, When a new keeper is to be chosen, do not tell them everything at once. Give them one rule at a time. Make them earn the ledger. I came to the decision like one comes to a slow frost. Incremental, apparently random, and then suddenly covering everything. Kayla asked for work. I had a stack of small repairs she could reasonably do. I gave her a key to the shed and a list of tasks. I watched as she improvised, as she fixed the leaky window in the kitchen with a strip of rubber I'd found in the workshop. Every night she slept with a thunking heart, but in the daytime she moved like a person who is surprised to be useful. The ledger became a thing I guarded with the same intensity as the lodge. I showed Kayla certain rules as if they were small kindnesses. Lock the back door before sundown, I said one evening as we sat with our hands wrapped around steaming mugs. Don't open the curtains that face the tree line between midnight and 3. If you hear the whistles, count to 9 and don't answer. She nodded as if I were a teacher. She took in the rules and apologized for not listening sooner or for not understanding. It felt strange to be in the position of authority. It felt worse to like it. And then there were the nights when the lodge pushed back harder than it had pushed before. The mounted heads became more than observers. They became enunciators, their turned faces becoming cues for us to react. One winter night the trophies arranged their gaze in a full arc around the great room and then, in the span of a few heartbeats, focused at the far window where the tree line meets the lake. The glass there bowed outward until it chimed with the sound of someone knocking from the other side, a sound that didn't match a hand in the world. There were faces at the glass that weren't only impressions now, they resolved into something like people with features that suggested age and hunger. Hundreds of small mouths at the panes. Kayla cried that night, a soft sound like someone trying to remember the shape of a lullaby. Why won't they stop? She asked me, and I didn't have an answer that would be useful. I know better than to hand a child absolutes. I could only hand her a rule I'd learned to recite like a prayer. Close the curtains, I told her. Do not open them until dawn. She did as instructed, and I felt a small thing unwind inside me, a relief akin to a bandage being readjusted. But that relief brought a new weight. The ledger had slowly become not only a survival manual, but a way to keep others compliant. I started, in late nights when the house hummed with hunger, to arrange small tasks for Kayla that involved the ledger. I asked her to bring water to the pantry, to set a cup of coffee on the mantel on certain nights, to check the basement door and report if it had been left ajar. There is a terrible logic in making another person your safety. You tell them tasks, and then you watch them perform those tasks and feel safer because they do. You feel complicit because you have given them the work. Kayla wanted to know more. I gave her small doses. She wanted to see the ledger. I let her read a page or two that I believed would be manageable. She asked the ledger's origin, and I told her stories that had gaps. We both pretended to laugh at parts that weren't funny. One night the lodge offered the mimicry of a merciful thing and nearly took Kayla for good. It was 1:59 a.m., and the telephone in the hallway rang with a sound like a small bell. On the other end was a voice using a name Kayla hadn't heard in 12 years. An aunt she had loved, and who had died when Kayla was young. The voice said things only that aunt could have known. An old secret. The name of a song Kayla had once hummed. Kayla's hands trembled and she stood up as if she could step into the phone's words and be folded back into the past. Don't answer it, I said. My voice came out too loud in the small night. I felt like both keeper and inmate trying to do the right thing. Play a name it cannot know. She blinked, searching my face for certainty. I gave her the name of a childhood friend who'd moved across the country when they were teenagers, a name the lodge could not have expected. She spoke it into the handset with the same kind of fear that happens when a person says a prayer aloud and isn't sure if they believe the words. The voice stuttered. For a long, holy moment, the line was silent. Then, the caller hung up. Kayla sank back onto the couch like a person who'd just escaped a narrow ledge. That night, I felt both relief and a subtle, growing cold. It is one thing to use a rule, and another to enjoy the feeling of using it to keep another alive. The ledger is a blunt moral instrument. It lets you survive by making others be careful, and in so doing it makes you an agent of the lodge's appetite. By spring, the ledger had thickened, and the house had learned a new repertoire. It started to imitate voices more audaciously, calls on the phone, words spoken through the radio, echoes of past laughter. Once, at 12:11 a.m., the fireplace spat up a string of syllables that pieced together into a conversation I'd had with my ex months before. A fight clipped into fragments that made my stomach sink. The voice was accurate enough to pull a memory from me that I had buried. I stood with my palm flat on the hearth and felt it vibrate with the amplification of my own history. There are manuals online about how to notice abuse in relationships. The lodge's methods read like one of those manuals, but with different verbs. It isolates, it rewrites, it normalizes dependency. It encourages you to ask for help, and then teaches you that the only one who can help you is the keeper who keeps the ledger. How convenient. I tried to resist becoming that keeper in earnest. I tried to be the person who barricaded the house from being given to the next person, the person who would bear it alone, and then find a way to sell it so no one else would have to hold the ledger. I learned again that the lodge respects only certain forms of resolve. It respects people who keep neat lists, and it punishes those who are messy. There came a night when I thought I could trick the ledger. I set up cameras in the hallways, little battery models that recorded in grainy black and white. I intended, in my small, human arrogance, to catch it in the act. I would prove that the faces at the window were illusions, that the voices belonged to no one but us, that Ray had been a man who made up rules to keep himself safe. I wanted evidence I could hold like a mirror and hand to a skeptic. The cameras captured nothing. They caught the lamplight and the way dust moved like an indecisive ocean. When I set them up, the trophies turned in unison, and then, later when I watched the footage, the tapes were full of blank frames. In one clip, there was a smear of light that resembled a hand, but when I tried to stop it on a still, the pixels collapsed to nothing. The cameras were respectful inventions, and the lodge was not impressed. More importantly, the attempts to outsmart it bared me. I had designed an argument, and the lodge had answered with silence. When Eli drove up to help after a supply run, he'd come back once with more tools and a face trained in reserve. We tried again. He wanted to remove a small trophy to see what might be inside the wall. We both remembered the way he'd tried before, and we'd both learned. His hands hovered over the mount, as if the air around it had a resistance. "We don't take things down," he said in a voice that sounded older than his years. "Not since—" He didn't finish. He said it like a man who had stories whose edges were blunt. He left again 2 days later with less luggage and fewer pretenses. Before he left, he tapped his knuckles on the ledger like a promise that wasn't meant to be kept. "If you leave," he said, "leave the ledger, or take it and run. Whatever you do, decide." He drove away and the tail lights bounced down the mountain, a small pair of red eyes that grew distant. I stayed. The ledger stayed with me as a weight I could rearrange. Time, in the lodge, moves by lists and small compromises. That is how I measured my months, by the times on the clock when the knocks came, by the numbers I counted in my head when the whistling started. I had rules for everything. I kept the rules for myself and for Kayla. But the ledger, in the end, required a keeper who would be willing to make the next little concession, to be the one to teach another person the rules. When Kayla arrived that second summer, her hair shorter and her laugh a little more brittle from wind, I realized I had started to like the rhythm of the lodge. I liked the small, domestic work of it, the mending, the keeping of lists, the making of tea at precise times. It felt like belonging in a way the city had never given me. In the morning, the lake would be a bowl of ink, and the aspens would shiver like the edges of pages being turned. I would make coffee and set a cup on the mantel because the ledger said to, and in doing so, I found myself less lonely. Ray's handwriting is in the ledger in cramped square letters, but at the back there is a different hand, a steady, small script that writes like someone who is trying to leave a final inheritance, not of property, but of method. I read the last few lines more nights than I slept. They said things that are at once tender and terrible. Journal excerpt, RH 9/17/2017. If you must pass it on, do it softly. Teach only what keeps them alive, and not what binds them. Let the ledger be an instrument of seasons, not chains. If you take it, do not let it be the only thing that says who you are. I understood then that Ray had tried to leave me both a thing and a way out. He had tried, with his temper and his notes and his dogged habit of leaving small offerings on the hearth, to give me a method. In his fumbled, stubborn way, he wrote what he could think to give. A compromise between safety and freedom. I did not keep that compromise, or perhaps I kept the part of it that suited me. I found a way to live in the leak between obligation and comfort. I instructed Kayla when necessary. I refused her certain things. No unsupervised nights in the East Wing. Do not, under any circumstance, look under the basement door. I promised her, as Reed had promised me, that keeping the ledger wouldn't mean imprisonment. But promises bend. There is a technique, call it a temptation technique, that the Lodge uses when it wants a person to stay. It feeds them a tiny, recurring mercy. For me, it was the sound of Ray's voice in the fireplace on winter nights, telling mechanic jokes that were only partly his. For Kayla, it was an apparition of her lost aunt that told her where she had once hidden a secret locket. These small mercies build a culture of return. You come back for the temperature and step into history. You return for a small kindness and stay to manage its aftercare, and then, inevitably, a final transfer. It was the kind you can rehearse on paper without knowing its cruelty. Kayla came down one afternoon, cheeks flushed from the cold, and sat at the table with a cup of coffee. Her hands hovered over the ledger like a person at a confession. "Teach me everything," she said. I thought of Ray's note about seasons and chains. I thought about Reed, and about Eli, and about the way the Lodge had measured me. There is a cruelty even in good intentions. I could have told her only what she needed to survive, and then insisted she leave town. I could have boxed the ledger and put it under a floorboard and sworn to myself that no one else would hold it. Or I could do what most keepers do when the cost is indecisive. I could let the ledger continue its work, rationalize the future, and pass a distilled version of the rules along. I showed her the rules, and I kept certain things from her. I taught her how to play a name it cannot know, how to count to 9 when the whistling begins, where to put the coffee and when to leave the porch light on. I watched as her face shaded from curiosity to a weary acceptance. There was a quiet in the room that felt like handing over a small animal. The ledger accepts hands that are willing. That is part of what makes it a trap. It requires consent in increments. A person signs for their imprisonment in small gestures. On the day Kayla received her key, I crossed a line in her favor. I wrote in the ledger a new rule, one I had not read before, and which had been typed in a ribbon of older paper and tucked behind Ray's last notes. It was not crossed out. It said, "If you must teach, give them one rule and let them find the rest." I paused before I handed the ledger to Kayla that first time. I remember the way the sunlight fell through the east window in a strip across the table, the dust motes like small planets. I will tell you now, plainly, that I felt a little like I was giving her a gift. I felt like I was being kind. That is what complicity looks like, a person who convinces themselves the hand they hold is warm and not sticky. She read for a long time. When she closed it, she looked at me as if the ledger had told her something she had not wanted to know, but which she accepted. "I'll be careful," she said. I believed her. The ledger requires a keeper. It requires someone to fold the house's needs into a pile small enough to be managed. The keeper is, in a way, a translator, the voice that says, "Do not open this," and place the cup there, and play a name they cannot know. The keeper keeps the house in the world of practicable things, but in doing so, the keeper also ensures the ledger survives. That survival is the lodge's desire. There were nights after Kayla's arrival when I stood at the window and watched the trees lean, and I understood the terrible symmetry of our arrangement. We had come to the lodge looking for shelter. The lodge had come to us looking for keepers. It does not require you to be monstrous at once. It asks for patience and accurate lists and a few sacrifices in the margins. You do them one by one and call them chores. The last true test came late in a spring that crept into the high country with sudden gusts and a late flurry. A stranger came to the gate one evening, thin and covered in road dust, asking for help with a flat tire. He said he was heading to a friend in Glenora and had lost his way. He had the kind of face people give passes to. He smelled of smoke and travel. In the past, I might have called to offer water and a hand. I knew with the ledger thumbed between my fingers that this was a test as much as a request. Do not let anyone who is not blood sleep unguarded in the East Wing, the ledger reminded me in raised square letters. I gave him a thermos and told him we had room in the garage, but nothing in the house. He sat on the porch steps and ate a sandwich Kayla had made, and all I could think about was how the lodge likes patterns of hospitality. It likes to be the place where strangers are warmed and then become small inventory in a book. After he left, Kayla and I counted the knocks together at midnight as a way of keeping humor in the shape of discipline. We laughed and it sounded ridiculous and necessary. The lodge, eavesdropping, listened, and then rewarded us with a night of relative calm. Reed said once that the lodge keeps accounts, and I had started to learn to read them in its quiet. Months slipped by. I filed new pages into the ledger, dates, small notations, the way new scratches appeared on the back door frame. Sometimes at night I would wake and hear someone outside calling a name that isn't mine, and I'd think of how the lodge keeps trying to find the right name to pin on you. You begin to expect it. You begin, occasionally, to be grateful for the small clarity of the ledger's lists. The language of ritual, once adopted, becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. Identity becomes the thing the lodge eats last. Eli visited one last time the following winter. He looked at me with a complexity that didn't have room for forgiveness. "You could have sold it," he said simply. "You chose this." "I don't think I chose it," I replied. It sounded like an excuse, and maybe it was. "I think I was rearranged." "By what?" he asked. "By grief," I said. "By the place where the past sits." He only nodded, and there was a loneliness in his nod that I couldn't change. He left his toolkit behind with a mute apology. "For the things that break." I put it in the shed beside Ray's old box of nails. The ledger kept growing and we kept tending to it. There are people who will read this and see me as a villain, a person who passed a wound along. There are people who will see me as someone who tried to keep a dangerous thing contained by small, desperate strategies. Both are true. I want to be honest in what follows because the ledger made me lie to myself in polite ways. There was a time when I thought of the lodge only as a responsibility, a pile of cold roofs and drafty windows and a useful house for a grieving woman. Then I started to like the order of it. I liked the receipts and the lists. I liked the way a neat row of cups on the mantel felt like an answer when the rest of my life was messy. Small domestic acts felt like moral acts. That, I think, is the lodge's greatest trick, making the mundane feel sacred enough to bind one to it. Now, in the ledger's last pages, pages with my handwriting thick and steady, there are rules I wrote. Some are helpful. Always wear a scarf when walking the dock in late fall. The wind takes the edges off common sense. Others are meaner. If a stranger calls and claims to be a dead relative, press the name of a childhood friend they couldn't possibly know, and if they insist, hang up. There are small, silly things like mend the sag in the north porch before the first heavy snow, and a single line where I blacked out a sentence my hand had written and then reconsidered. On a late afternoon when the aspens were a gold sewn into the mountain, Kayla stood on the porch with her key in her palm, half afraid to use it. She asked me something I should have answered with a lie. "Will I ever leave?" she asked. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to give her the kind of lie that frees a person to act. Instead, I said, "Maybe, but you'll carry the ledger with you even if you go." It was the truth. She laughed in a way that had small sadness in it, and then tucked the key into her pocket like she was folding a map. There will be those who read the ledger and think I was a coward for not burning it. There will be those who think I am cruel for teaching Kayla at all. The ledger is not a simple instrument. It requires caretakers who are complicated, and sometimes cruel, and often simply tired. I cannot claim nobility. I can only tell you what happened. The last entry in the ledger with my hand in it reads like a lullaby, written by someone who does not like to sing. Keep it neat, keep it thin, teach the small rules, and then teach nothing more. Let the house be a season in another person's life, not a life itself. I folded the ledger and placed it in the bottom drawer of Ray's old desk. Then I took out a sheet of typewriter paper and typed, in a crude font, "Lock the back door before sunset. Do not open curtains facing the tree line between midnight and 3 a.m. If the mounted heads turn to watch you, pretend not to notice. Leave a cup of coffee on the mantel at first snowfall. If someone calls with a familiar voice, play a name they cannot know." I blacked out one line with a thick marker until the type underneath was a soft, unreadable stain, something I had rescued from Ray's habit of erasures. I slid the paper into an envelope and sealed it. It felt, in a small way, like mercy. A month later, Kayla left for a season to work in town. She came back, as people do, with less certainty and more tools for sleep. She told me once that she'd been thinking of moving to a place closer to a city. I told her I'd help her when the time came. That was true. I also told her, when she asked, that the lodge would not be easy to get away from if she let it learn her too well. That I had tried to keep the rules thin and had not succeeded altogether. That was true too. There are things the ledger does not list. It does not list the small kindnesses people do for one another when their life is tangled with another's. It does not take account of a hummingbird of hope that visits in the heated days of spring. It ignores them because the ledger keeps other ledgers. But human lives leak into places sometimes anyway. The smell of someone who made you laugh, the memory of a joke. That leak is a mercy, and also a crack. When I look back now from where I am, older, quieter, with hands that have learned to accept the shape of the house, I can see the ledger's logic clearly, like a river's path traced after the water has run. It is orderly and terrible. It offers respite in the form of chores, community in the form of rules, and a kind of family in the way it collects the names of those who tend to it. It is also an appetite. What I want to make clear is this. I did not start the lodge. I did not write all the rules. I inherited them, and then I taught someone else a portion of them. Perhaps that makes me a villain in people's eyes. Perhaps it makes me a pragmatist. In my bones, it makes me a person who wanted a shelter and then made a house into a covenant because it felt easier than the empty blue of the road. Sometimes I dream of leaving, and then I awake with the ledger under my hand and the clock on the mantel like a patient eye. In the dream, the trees do not lean toward the lodge as listeners. They lean like people who have been leaning a lifetime and finally have something to hold. The lake is still bottomless, and I have come to believe that our small measures, cups of coffee on mantels, drawn curtains, careful names, are not merely trinkets, but bridges. The ledger is a bridge the lodge demands we walk across again and again. If you are watching or reading this because you like stories set in isolated places, because you like the slow burn of a house that needs tending, understand this truth. A place like Blackwater Lodge doesn't only haunt, it lures. It makes bargains and keeps receipts. It asks for small things and expects them forever. It requires a keeper because it is a ledger, and ledgers require someone to balance the books. I do not know if the lodge will ever stop needing someone. Maybe it is part of the mountain. Maybe it is a hunger that has always belonged to certain architectures of place. What I do know is that I moved into my family's old hunting lodge in Colorado, and I followed rules that were written by people with tired hands. I tried to keep them thin. I taught another person how to keep them neat. The ledger remains in the drawer, its pages soft with use, its lines both instruction and confession. If this story has a moral, it is not a neat one. Maybe it is that inheritance is rarely a gift, and more often a ledger of debts. Maybe it is that houses remember, and that what they remember can shape you. Maybe it is that bargains once made demand steady payments. The lodge is still there, on the edge of Blackwater Lake, its shingles dark in the late afternoon, its windows reflecting the aspens and the sky. The trees still lean toward it, as if listening. At night someone knocks 3 times, or maybe that is only the rhythm of my own pulse. Kayla knows the rules I taught her, and she keeps them. I teach her new, small rules when I think she is ready. Sometimes she teaches me back how to laugh at the thing that aches. I am both less and more than the person who arrived in a U-Haul weeks after the funeral. I am the keeper, and also in some ways, the kept. I have learned to fold the house into my life, and to let go of illusions of simple freedom. That is not a confession I offer melodramatically. It is simply the truth of having chosen an arrangement and carrying the consequences. If you want more long-form, true-ish horror accounts like this one, hit subscribe. There are plenty of haunted houses that prefer to stay private, but some of them put their stories into the world, and some people listen. I do not say this to absolve myself. I say this because the ledger, even now, is a thing that will need hands. There will be nights when the knocks come in 3 precise beats, and I will count them and decide whether to answer in a way that keeps us safe or in a way that keeps us whole. That is the work of a keeper. Small acts of arithmetic, a gentle cruelty, 1,000 small mercies folded into the margins of the pages. The last line I wrote in Ray's ledger is a poor admonition, and perhaps the only honest one I can give. Keep the rules thin. Keep them neat. Teach one, then teach nothing more. Let the house be a season, not a life. Outside, the aspens tremble. The lake keeps its depth. The mounted heads hang in the great room like guardians and like witnesses. I will fold this paper back into the drawer, turn the key, and go make coffee. The rules are on the page. We will follow them tomorrow. The house will learn, and then, like it always does, it will ask for one more thing.